Welcome to season one of the Make Boards Work podcast. Today's guest is Ritesh Doshi, formerly a global banker in London, San Francisco, and Amman, Jordan, among others. And for many years now, an entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of Spring Valley Coffee. Actually, Ritesh, when I see your background, this beautiful lush garden, I'd like to be in the coffee business as well. Welcome, Ritesh.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for having me, and it's great to be here.
Ritesh, I think you have a unique vantage point in two ways, even, for our discussion about what makes boards work. You have been formerly in senior professional services as a banker, dealing largely with large corporations, and now you're an entrepreneur, building your own company. And you have your own advisory board for your company, but you also have served on other people's boards. So let's start with the first. How do boards of large corporates compare to your own board?
So one, having been a senior exec at a bank, but not having served on the board, I've always found that boards at large corporates are quite removed. And a lot of those boards are made up of non-executives and are often quite removed from the business, end up being subject matter experts or there because of other reasons, be it political, be it kind of profile. Whereas in a business like mine, or in the boards that I've served on for smaller businesses, I think it's really important to have somebody who actually adds value to the business. And for me, that's having a subject matter expert or somebody who has a skill that I don't have. Often I found in corporate boards, they're just senior people that have done the same thing, maybe somewhere else in a different region or for a much longer period of time.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to follow up on that, kind of this, to gel out this differentiation a bit more. You expect your board to add value. And that can be, I think what I heard is skills or competencies that you might lack. So you complement kind of your own skill set. Vis-a-vis the large corporations where it's a bit more political, I understood.
And I don't say that in a negative way, but I think often in a large board, there's a lot more profile, a lot more, there's a lot more vetting that goes into a board member for a large organization because they have to fit a certain profile, they have to be of a certain caliber, have certain educational standards. Whereas in a business like mine, and for smaller businesses, I think having people that are subject matter experts that can add value, have skills that I don't have, but open up networks that I may not have networks to. And often people that, in my case, all of them have been entrepreneurs before. So for me, they have served in a different way. They have been on the journey before, and they're not just perhaps telling me, what should or could be done, but actually having been on that journey in a parallel way. And people that are not afraid to have very open, very candid, very difficult conversations.
Those I find really important nuggets now. So you say the people you have on your board, they have been entrepreneurs, no exception.
Correct.
How does that really help you? How does that kind of materialize for you?
So I think, I take that back. There are three entrepreneurs and one professional venture investor who works with a lot of entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. So tangentially is also connected. But I think for me, having somebody who's been an entrepreneur before, and one of my board members is, I've got two that are kind of, one that's probably about 10 years older, one that's probably about 20 years older. And they bring something different because the one who's significantly older brings that maturity, having built businesses at a different time, but having seen entrepreneurs through multiple life cycles. And when things get bad, providing perspective and saying, actually, I've been there and things will get better. Offering that when you're, at least for me, when I'm kind of head down in my zone, only seeing kind of the worst or when things get quite dark. The other example is an entrepreneur who's a high growth, very structured, runs a significantly larger business, but will sit down. And there are also cultural differences. He's a Dutch guy. And literally the first time I asked him to join my board, he said, I will join your board under one condition. He goes, I never want to have a scheduling conversation with you again. He goes, you need to hire an executive assistant who manages your time and manages your diary. He goes, so that you and I can spend time whenever we get together once a month at one-on-one, quarterly for a board meeting, where I can add value to you. You can ask me meaningful conversations, but we shouldn't be talking about when are we going to have a coffee? When are we going to go for a run? And the other reason I like having entrepreneurs as board members, we often share similar lifestyles, similar things. So actually with one of my board members, I have a running meeting. Every month we go for a run, we go for a 10K run. and it's a running meeting.
Kudos to that person. I know you're an avid marathon runner, so a guy who commits to do running meetings with you. My respect. I've been running with you in Amman, yeah, kudos to that guy. I couldn't discuss while I run with you. Let's go a bit to this ability to have difficult conversations. Maybe share an anecdote, share, if possible, an experience along those lines. I think that's crucial, right? That's what really makes sports work, having these difficult
Well,
conversations.
Well, there's one actually very pertinent, which was actually just like 4 days ago. This past Saturday, we actually had, it wasn't a full board meeting, but it was actually about what the next kind of 2 quarters looks like. From there's a bunch of opportunities and projects that have presented themselves, and being an entrepreneur and the eternal optimist, I'm like, let's do all of them. And one of my board members, the one who's a venture investor, said, well, hold on, you want to do everything. The cash situation doesn't allow for it. Yes, we're profitable, we're generating cash, but you really need to think about what you want to prioritize and saying you may want to do everything. You may have to walk away from some opportunities, or you may have to punt some down the line. But actually saying you want to do these things, you may have even made commitments, which I had. I made commitments to employees about growth. I made commitments to potential partners, construction partners or other people. And those things now can't happen. But it's somebody sitting me down and hearing what I don't necessarily want to hear and saying, you know what, you've committed these things, but those things are not possible. And you're going to drive the business, potentially into a wall if you don't make the hard decisions and have the hard conversations, which relatively are easier today than having that conversation 3 or 6 months from now. And that's, like I said, it wasn't a full board meeting. It was a very specific finance related meeting. So he sat down with the board member. And I guess for me, Mark, there's 3 things. I have 4 board members. I view all of them as bringing different things to the table. So I have one that brings a venture mindset, which is very much a growth mindset. There's one that runs an FMCG business here, at the complete opposite end of the spectrum that we operate at. We're a premium specialty coffee brand. He runs a business that makes snack foods. So at the opposite end, but understands local retail, understands local dynamics. Another board member has built multiple businesses in agriculture across multiple geographies in Europe, Asia, and here in Africa, and is incredibly dynamic, but moves at pace. I mean, he moves faster than I move, which for me is, when I feel I have to keep up with him, it's somebody who's really pushing me to my limits, which I think is great. And the 4th board member is somebody who's about 20 years older. He's been a chairman of private companies, public companies, and just brings that a bit more of a stoic approach, a bit more of a calm approach that balances out the high energy on one side, the growth mindset. For me, it was quite intentional. And I think for me, building that board intentionally for different skill sets is important. I've actually changed board members over the years because the businesses needed different things. So I've dropped one person off, added a different person. And I've said to everybody openly, that's not a personal thing, but at some point I will need something different over time.
Okay. Yes. Now it's stable and good again. I did hear the very specific, very intentional way how you structured your board with very specific skill sets that complement you, that you can really use and for building and expanding your business. One question on that. I learned when I worked with Northvolt, the failed European battery play. They were similarly intentional in building their board, but they also considered that those skills might have a finite time horizon. So they really had built their board in stages. Kind of what have you considered that maybe at some point one skill requirement expires and another might come in, or how do you structure that?
So, Mark, I think that's exactly where the connection dropped off. So what I said is, I think those skills do change over time. And actually, we dropped off a board member that skill wasn't required anymore, and that was replaced with somebody else. And the conversation I've had with all of our board members is, I really value the input. I really value, what you bring to the table, but the business may need different things at different stages. And, we have a board of 4 today. We always had a board of 4, but, the composition has changed. So 2 people have come on, 2 people have come off over the last couple of years. So I think it's actually super critical, because what I needed when I was a $1 million business versus what I need as a $5 million business, and what I will need when I'm a $10 million business are going to be very, very different.
Exactly.
So so absolutely, and I also think people have different networks, different skill sets. What's interesting for us is we're still a privately held business. We have no
Yeah.
outside investors, and people are like, well, what's in it for a board member, right? Why, like, there's there's no equity upside. We
Yeah.
actually don't pay board fees. We give away a lot of free coffee. But it's for people that genuinely, and for all of them, there's a personal connection to me, but they're invested in our success. Now, as we're successful, as the business grows, of course, I want them to benefit from that as well, and I think that's important. We have not established a formal mechanism to make that happen,
Interesting.
but I've offered that commitment based on, for many of these relationships, 20, 30, the longest one probably, a 35-year-old relationship. So
Wow.
being able
Wow.
being able to say, people, come on the journey. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I will make it worth your while. And I think that's been really important to me as well.
Fantastic. Two things I'd like to pick up on. One, just want to reiterate the wisdom, I think, that you demonstrated with having these finite board terms, and make that very explicit with your board advisors, with your board members, that maybe it's a role for a few years, and it might be that you want to change and need different skill sets. I think not having that can lead to very awkward situations, because it's very difficult to ask people to leave a board unless you have had that made explicit from the start, that it might be a two-year time horizon, or just make it renewable, right? So you really kind of periodically have these discussions.
So we actually have it as, the intention is for it to be 2 years, but we actually say there's an option to renew both ways every year. And
Exactly.
I mean, everybody stayed for at least 2 years, but also people's circumstances and situations change. They may have something that happens in their life, and I don't want
Correct.
people to feel that
Correct.
they've committed and they have to be here. I mean, in that situation, for me, Mark, I have I served on boards. In fact, one of my board members, I served on his board, and I was on his board for many years, for 7 years, when he wasn't the CEO. When it and what's interesting is, I had a very difficult conversation where I wanted to exit that board, not because the company's had done amazingly, continues to do amazingly, but I really needed to focus on our business as we were growing. And it was actually a difficult conversation. I said, "Hey, I think I've added value, but I need to come off your board. By the way, I really need your help. Will you actually join my board as well?" So it went from me being on his board, me helping move that person into the CEO role, then me leaving his board, and then him joining my board. And that all happened in a very, very short period. But I'm actually getting value in a very different way. And the dynamic is actually, it's different, and it's interesting being on the receiving end of that, having been on the giving end of that.
Which is a beautiful segue to get to my second, unique vantage point that you have, serving on, another company's board, but also having your own board. Tell me a little bit, kind of what you see as advantages of having kind of this dual experience.
Sure. So having been on a board of a company which is significantly bigger than us, is just learning what it means to be a board member, learning what it means. And for a while, I felt I had imposter syndrome. I'm like, why do they want me on the board? I don't know anything about their business. They run this great business. But actually, there were skills and things that I had that they were perhaps didn't have at the time, that they built over time. But I think for me, sitting sitting on someone's board taught me about how corporate governance can work in a large organization, what we may need to aspire towards. It taught me about the diversity of board members. I sat on that board, and on that board, it was interesting. There were only two of us on that board. And I was the young upstart entrepreneur, and there was this much older, you know, gentleman who runs an accounting practice. He's a chairman of a bank, and we're at opposite ends of the spectrum. But actually, I learned so much having different perspectives, different views at the table. And having learned that, that's where it helped me build a board intentionally. Not necessarily people that will get along, that are going to be the best of friends, but that offers something different. And having served, it also taught me what I expected from my board members when I set one up. What are the levels of things that I initially got frustrated with, that there wasn't enough documentation or preparedness going in, and that got much better. And it also showed me what I had to offer my board members if I want them to actually contribute in a meaningful way. what does that look like? And what do I need to expect from them? Well, to get the best out of them, what do I need to give to them? I think that dual perspective, and I think I served on that board for almost 7 years. And I think the other thing I learned from that was having the finite periods. I felt guilty about leaving to focus on my business.
Yeah.
I perhaps should have done it 1 or 2 years earlier, and I didn't, because there was no mechanism to do that. So
Yes.
I think it helped me think about how I wanted to design my board. That was one. I mean, that was in one company. I've sat on 2 other boards. One of a nonprofit. I mean, we've sat on multiple EO committees, and I mean, you've sat on a global board. I sat on local, country, and regional boards, which has been really powerful. But also, I've been on the boards of 2 other companies here in Kenya, and for both of those, I quickly learned what I didn't like. I learned about the things that weren't working for me, whether it was the lack of cadence, whether it was the lack of preparation, whether it was actually, and again, in all cases, they were advisory boards, so it didn't have kind of corporate governance decision-making authority. But when input wasn't necessarily utilized, not even saying accepted, but actually just utilized to determine a decision, it made me question what value I was giving, but then what was the purpose of me being there? And back to your initial question about large companies, I do find a lot of large company boards are just a rubber stamp. And for me, that has absolutely no interest for me. For me, it's got to be somebody who's bringing something to the table and who really feels that they're part of our growth story. I'm grateful to say many of our board members saw us as an upstart and have seen us grow into the largest specialty coffee roaster on the continent. And they've been on that journey with us for 8 years.
Yes. Getting back to this notion of being very clear on what you expect of board members, and with that also gaining clarity on what you need to provide, what you need to give. Please elaborate a little bit on this one, on information flow. How do you keep your board members sufficiently informed that they have enough context, well knowing that they're not, as you, running the business day to day, right? How do you handle that?
So I'm operating my board in a bit of a different way at the moment, Mark, which is an interesting thing. So I'm going to change it up in a couple of months. So right now, for the last 1 year, I've actually not done the board meetings with everybody together. I've been getting value from my board members individually. So I try and see every single board member or chat to them once a quarter. And that could be over a run, that could be over a coffee, but I may need them for a specific thing. I may need a board member to come in and spend time with my CFO. I may need a board member to interview a senior hire for our international expansion. So at the moment, I'm getting a lot of value on those one-on-one conversations. And to provide context for that, I'm giving them the context for that conversation. So we're not having high-level conversations about budgeting, planning, what does that look like? I'm presenting it, everybody signs off, but I'm sending it, we get comments back, and it's not a huge discussion. And that's how we've been running it for the last, I want to say, 15 months. So for all of last year. And I've gotten value in that way in the last 15 months. I would like to go back towards the end of this year. Our financial year ends in September. From October 1, I want to go back to a more traditional structured board meeting because now we have a senior leadership team that I want presenting to the board. It's always been me. And,
yes, understood.
And the preparedness of that is, you're right. You don't want to send them too much information, but are we sharing? Is it budgets? Is it targets? But also, what are the 3 biggest things that we're working on for the next quarter? What are the 5 big things we're working on for the year? And is that aligned to where the market's going? I mean, an example that I will give is, we expanded internationally into London in 2025, and that was actually quite a heated board conversation. They're like, hold on. There was one point of view where someone's like, you have to be the domain expert. You have to be the market leader in your home market before you go abroad. There was a different perspective. It's like, actually, no, we should grow now, strike while the iron's hot, while we have capital, while we have funds, while the brand is on an upward trajectory. Now's the time to go. There was somebody who was super conservative who was like, we shouldn't be spending any money on this unknown entity. And there was somebody that's like, let's double down and bet the house. And that ended up being, I wouldn't say that the board meeting was haywire, but that was the last board meeting that we had that was quite a heated. That was at the end of 2020, at the end of 23. And that was quite a heated conversation about what does that look like? And at the end of the day, the good thing is, as an advisory board, I got that input from everybody. And I said, listen, the view that I take as the entrepreneur in a coffee hospitality business is I want to be experience led. So to be experience led, I want to build a cafe. Yes, we could have gone down the e-commerce route. We could have done something else, but that's the DNA of our business. And what's been amazing since that happened is that everybody on the board has been, once we made the decision, everyone's, even the ones that vehemently disagree, have been super supportive and have opened up whatever doors, networks, opportunities, to the business, which has been incredible.
Beautiful. Great case of disagree and commit. And raising the concerns, but then it's your call and you go with it. I think that's how a board should operate. What you just described, the way you currently run your board, which is a bit non-traditional and probably kind of, I recently posted on LinkedIn and called that governance light, right? Designing your board, especially, I mainly spoke about very early stage companies, have as little overhead as possible, try to distill the value of people who have been there, done that, maybe a few years more than a young founder might have. And I think your version is a beautiful alternative to a bit of a governance light, to just making sure you extract the value. Getting back to this learning about governance, you mentioned, okay, you learned from this other board because the larger championship is a bit, how corporate governance truly works. And now you said, okay, from September on, you want to have a bit more respect, a bit more structure, a bit more kind of traditional governance. What will that bring? What do you aspire to achieve by that? What is your hope for that?
The hope for that is actually for my leadership team. The hope for that is that they're, for a long time, and that's also grown in the last couple of years. And, we've had 2 additions, 2 departures, and that's again growing for what the business needs. But I think many of them and many of us are still in the business. I'm now able to take a bit of a step back. I want them to be able to actually be on our business. And the only way they're going to have that perspective is if the head of cafes has to come in and present to the board about what's the cafe's performance over the last 6 months, but also what's the plan for the next 6 months. And committing, not to me as the CEO, but actually committing to external people that these are the things that I'm doing. And I think it is offering that commitment and somebody holding them. Yes, I can hold them accountable. Our CEO is incredible, can hold them accountable as well, but actually committing to somebody somewhere to do that. And the board's the right place to do that. So and the reason I'm saying October is, as we've had a couple of people join, a couple of people transitioning out. And when that leadership team for me will be locked from April, it gives them 6 months to get settled. So then by October, they're able to present the plan for the year ahead, but also report on what happened on the at least on the 6 months before, if not the full year. So I think it's that commitment, it's being held accountable, but also giving them direct access to those board members. So for example, our head of operations, the one of our board members who runs a large FMCG business, they have a direct connection. So if he's stuck on anything operationally, I want him to be able to connect. It doesn't have to filter through me. The relationship, I don't need to be the gatekeeper of that relationship. Or my CFO, it's really important for her to be able to talk to both my board members, one who's a venture capitalist and one who's a chartered accountant, about anything financial related. And in fact, the example that I gave of this past weekend, she was struggling to pin me down to commit to only doing certain projects. She's like, I'm stuck with you. I'm speaking to the board member of finance. And that was great. And she spoke to them and said, listen, this is what I'm struggling with. Ritesh wants to do 10 projects. I've got the budget to do 4. We need to sit him down and have this conversation. And she had that direct conversation. And for me, that's incredibly powerful.
I think, Ritesh, that's a beautiful example. What sometimes is referred to as skip level meeting, where you kind of pass the hierarchy. And I've seen quite a few people being very skeptical and sometimes even a bit afraid of that. Whereas I see you being perfectly at ease because you see there's value in it, right? There's value in connecting my senior leadership team, my executive team, directly to senior board members who have the relevant experience. Why, I don't need to be the parrot in the middle. They can talk directly. And with that, I think you add an additional benefit of the board members having this rich context of also informal information flows and being able in a much better position to actually add value because they have a richer context as a sparring partner for you and your executive team.
Correct. And I think that also for me is quiet confidence in the sense that also if we want to scale our business, the information flows, one, don't need to come through me. And the second is I need to be held accountable. It's the advisory board holding me accountable. And it's easier for them to say yes or no, or you should or you shouldn't, if they have context from somebody else. So I think it's incredibly important.
Fantastic. You alluded to a few things that you have observed in other boards as not working. You refer to the preparation of the board meeting. You also do the cadence. Elaborate a little bit on those, kind of the no-goes, and also possibly some other things that you learned that don't work, that you want to avoid in your own board.
Sure. And some mistakes I still keep making, by the way. So the cadence of our board meetings has been a bit haphazard, and I think that's kind of connected to my travel recently and the international growth. But I think for me, early on is one, it's not just getting the information. And you asked a really interesting question, Mark, which is about what's the relevant information. I just get a board pack with a finance pack this thick. And I'm like, hold on, you guys had me on the board to think about the customer journey. You had me on the board to think about the marketing. You have me on the board to think about, leadership design. I'm not on the board to sit and look at your numbers. You have an accountant, you have a CFO. But I felt that often the amount of information was quite kind of unnecessary. The second is it relevant? Is it relevant to everybody and everybody's input that you need? The third thing that didn't work was the short time. So often we got information and a large chunk of it, but it came very late. So I'd rather, if it's going to come late, which often happens in a small business, then it has to be a limited amount of information, in my own opinion, in my experience. If there's a lot of information to go through, people need time and they need and I've been on the other side of receiving significant board packs, which are very, very useful, but I think there's a time and a place for both. I personally like meeting. I've liked having a cadence. I currently am loving not having a cadence. I'm going to go back to one, but I think having a consistent cadence, whether it's monthly or quarterly. One thing that I found is quarterly was too long. Mm-hmm. I felt to have significant change. Because by the time you review information, then that gets fed back to management, you can't course correct your change. So one of the recommendations I made to one of the boards that I was on is quarterly is not going to work. I think monthly is quite intense. 3 times a quarter is a lot. But the question is there something in between? Can you meet every 6 weeks? Mm-hmm. Right? So it's again in a non-traditional sense, but you're meeting twice a quarter, you're meeting, 8 times a year. It allows you, and then you can do one nice thing at the end of the year, the beginning for Christmas or something to celebrate the wins. But it just means you're getting together on a relatively regular cadence because again, the traditional timeframes didn't work. I mean, our management team meets weekly. I would have nothing to report to my board on a monthly basis. So timing, of course, cadence, amount of information. But I also think, for me, one of the things that didn't work is when you're on a board and the internal board dynamics between shareholders, when they don't have alignment or clarity, that puts the board in a difficult position. Mm-hmm. And I've been in a situation where in a family structure where there are 2 different parts of a family that have 2 very different objectives. In one case, there were 2 sides of a family, but 2 generations on one side, one generation had very different objectives. And one part of the family wanted to sell and exit. One part of the family is like, we want to double down and grow this. And that puts board members in a difficult position. So I think that alignment, or if you have a board member who's a family business specialist, who's able to help one navigate through those waters. So I think that can sometimes become a little bit awkward.
Very, very interesting. Talk a bit more about, I want to come back to the family business situation in a second, but first, this notion of making sure that it's the relevant information in the board pack. Obviously, and you made the example, right? Your angle is more the consumer experience. So the financials, it's probably not your domain on that board. But still, the board, in another way, the board needs to have a comprehensive picture, right? You also have a fiduciary duty to make sure that you need to be cognizant of the company's financials. So where's the fine line? Where is the good compromise of having this relevant information? How do you decide in your own board what you provide and what you expect?
So I think for me, if I use that example, I think too much information means the relevant stuff gets lost, right? Yeah. And I think in that situation, Kenya was going through a difficult time in the retail space. A bunch of retailers were going under. And if you have exposure to those, well, there's a lot of credit risk. What would have been a lot more interesting, here's the full board pack, but actually the decisions we're making on what are the credit limits, who do we want to not supply, so what's the or even potentially highlighting, providing the context to saying, hey, this is the stuff that actually we need to make a decision on. So if you're going to hone your energy on the 3 days before the board meeting, focus on these 3 sections that helps us determine the right direction. And that's evolved over time, and that's gotten right. So for me, I'm like, all of our, so for example, we're now running on an ERP. All of our board members have a link. They can access whatever detailed level of information they want. So everybody has a board link. They can see it's view only. But what we want to give them is, this is for the purposes of this board discussion. Let's use the example of this past weekend. There's 10 potential projects that Ritesh has in his head. We can really afford 4. What are those costs? What's the cash flow implication? What's the people implication? What does that look like? And that's the relevant information to make a decision on that. Everything else is still available if you want to see it at any point in time, but this is what will help you reach the decision you need to reach. So I think guiding and directing people, because I'll be the first one to say, when I've received a 125-page board pack, I've read 25 pages of it. Not because I'm not committed to the board, just because 100 pages of it may not be relevant in that situation.
Understood. Now, coming back to your family business example, just another episode of within season 1 is with Stefan Kirchhoff, and he talks explicitly and extensively about these family business situations, which he has own experience. And it's a prime example of, where people on the board, in a way, have their own agenda, they have their own interests, but at the same time, they're directors of the business. So there's this dimension, okay, what's best for me? I want liquidity, or I believe in the business and invest in it, but also kind of what's the interest of the business? Because as board directors, really that's the primary angle, is fiduciaries of the company's well-being. So how did that play out? Because that's a tough one to crack.
It was, and I think that's also why I think the founders realized that over time, as that became multi-generational, 2 wings of a family, the reason they had 2 external board members is for someone to look at that without a vested interest in the financial outcomes of the business. So it's really fine, Mark. I've grown. I don't come from a family business, but I've grown up a lot around a huge family business community on the extended family on both my mom and my dad's side, a number of my friends, and the challenges you talk about are very real. And often some of the informal conversations I have, and and I had one with a fellow EO member yesterday, was hey, I'm struggling with this in my family business. Let's have a chat. But I think getting older, sometimes getting people from a different generation or different educational levels to say, we want somebody external being able to look into our business to offer perspective, I think has been hard. I think it's shifting. I think people are bringing in experts that are family business experts, trust experts, but also in some cases, and I use the example of the boards that I've been on, 2 of them have been family businesses, and they wanted somebody who wasn't in the family, but who understands the family context. But the most interesting question, one person, and there was a board that I ended up not joining, but they're still very good friends of mine, and I just didn't have the time and the bandwidth. But the conversation that they asked me is, we need to determine, are we a business family first, where the business comes first and the family reaps the dividends? Or are we a family business where the family comes first?
Yes.
And if the business suffers but the family stays together, is more important. And I think if a family is able to have that clarity, and that was really interesting for me, because I don't have a family business, but I view my senior leadership team as people closely. There are people that are participating in our upside, and if at some point there is an exit, they'll participate in that. But I also have to look after their financial interests, and I can only imagine how complex that is. And not imagine, I know how complex it is in a family structure. But I think having that clarity is so powerful. So are we family first or business first?
Beautiful. Yes, that's a very beautiful frame. And I think, just again, picking up on something that you mentioned that I believe in is of huge value in such situations, is the value of having external or independent directors to navigate such conflicts, where you have at least one or possibly several members who don't have that agenda issue, who have a clear view, just being independent, being external, Again, they might not have the final say, but they can help navigate such conflicts and contribute to a healthy board dynamic.
No, absolutely, and I think I have felt it on my board because of the 4 people that are on my board, 3 of them are independent. So
Yeah.
so what's interesting about that is they have no vested interest except to see the business grow and succeed, and therefore the people that work in the business and the shareholders. So I think where I think the balance of the struggle for me becomes is at what point is it advisory versus them actually being able to make a decision. And the way we're structured and incorporated in the governance structure and the legal frameworks that exist in Kenya, our board is an advisory board because otherwise it
Yeah.
also opens them up. And actually, one of my board members said this to me. I don't want to be opened up to other kind of potential liabilities or potential kind of exposure. So I don't want to be a director. I'm happy to be on the advisory board, but I do not want to be a director in your business. Um, and and but that council is very much taken on board.
Yes. Which I think is again a beautiful point that sometimes I feel is a bit underappreciated. That with a formal director role comes a lot of responsibility and comes a lot of legal exposure. Right? In most jurisdictions, as a director, you can be quite easily held liable if things turns south.
Correct.
Fantastic. Ritesh, is there anything you'd like to share that we haven't touched upon yet before I get to my final question?
I think the only thing that I'd like to share is, having served on corporate boards of other companies, having an advisory board of my own, I think the one thing which is really interesting is I perhaps learned the most serving on a nonprofit board and serving on the board of my local EO chapter, my regional chapter, because the structures, the processes existed, and many of those tools, many of those agendas, I have actually brought into my business. And I think, a lot of people, I know people that have served for nonprofits, community things, because they want to give back, which is amazing. And they give a lot of time and energy, and I do. But there's also people do it for prestige. But I think there's so much to learn. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway is I'm happy to serve on someone's board. It's really funny for me. I've always felt like you want my expertise, but actually I come away learning so much more. I learn more coming off or out of someone's board than what I think I may have contributed. I think they've seen value. I'm like, but I came away so much more enlightened. And I think that's my biggest takeaway.
I totally subscribe to that. Having served on EO's global board, I said, in a way, it was my second MBA, right? I had another very steep learning curve. And, possibly some people dismiss that, but I am a firm believer that, what makes a not-for-profit board truly gel and truly work well and add value, that the behavioral foundations, the processes, they're very similar to a corporate board that needs to work well. I think there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot to learn from. Fully agree.
Yeah.
Having said that, Ritesh, for your company, Spring Valley Coffee, if you could design your dream board, no limits. It can be, anybody is up for grabs. Anybody will pick up your phone and say yes. Even people who are not among us anymore. Who would be on your dream team board for your company?
Really, really interesting question, Mark. Wow, that's a tough one. I wouldn't want to. That's a good question. So the way that our board is comprised is the people have domain expertise. So from a coffee perspective, I would probably ask for James Freeman, who's the founder of Blue Bottle. I think they've done a tremendous job of really taking the best of Eastern Japanese omasake coffee and bringing that to kind of the premium kind of market. So from a coffee perspective, I think from a futurist perspective and just really thinking about things in a forward way is Seth Godin. And I was very lucky I had an opportunity to speak with Seth, a couple of months ago. And I think I swear by a lot of his books. Some of them are mandatory reading. The third person from a hospitality perspective would be Danny Meyer. Danny Meyer's books, I didn't even know who he was, even have I've been in the industry for over a decade now. I walked into one of his restaurants in New York, an incredible experience, and was so blown away. I kind of went in a rabbit hole, ended up buying his books. I have a stack of his books in my desk that I hand out to everybody. But his version of hospitality is what we aspire to. He has just documented it so well. So yeah, I would say Danny Meyer, James Freeman, and Seth Godin are the people that I'd have on my board.
Fantastic. I saw Danny Meyer at an event last November, actually. So very, very impressive. It still is my hope, though, that come June, July, you also have a stack of my books to hand out.
Absolutely. I very, very much look forward to having them.
Ritesh, thank you so much. It's been enlightening. It's been inspiring to converse with you, to learn from you, to hear your views. I'm very sure our listeners and viewers will find tremendous value in your sharings, in your experience. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show. Thank you.
No, Mark, thank you for having me. I mean, I always enjoy spending time with you. I always learn so much and just have a great time, chatting with you. So we're going to have to do a running meeting the next time I see you.
Yes, I better practice for that.